us Dr. David Schmidtz from the University of Arizona. He teaches philosophy and economics there. He's the founding director of the Center for the Philosophy of Freedom and the editor of the Social Philosophy and Policy Journal. He's speaking to us today about corruption. Help me welcome him.
Thank you for having me here to visit. Delighted to be here. So I'm going to talk about corruption. So which social arrangements have a history of fostering progress and prosperity, in some sense, or the bottom line? Well, here's a quick answer, falsely attributed to Adam Smith, which is to say, we're guided as if by an invisible hand to do what builds the wealth of nations. Don't worry about it, it'll take care of itself. A more sober answer, which is closer to what Smith said and believed, is if we have the right framework of rules, steering us away from buying and selling monopoly privileges, which is one of Adam Smith's main concerns, steering us toward being valuable to the people around us, then will indeed be part of the engine that drives human progress and the wealth of nations. But to have a rule of law framework within which markets can grow a healthy nation, we have to exercise some oversight. That's the idea. So there are going to be officials that not only enforce the rules, but they also interpret and amend the rules and so on, and there is some room for mischief. So Adam Smith saw this, and he also saw a chronically tragic reality, which is that this power to oversee markets, that's precisely what crony capitalists are buying and selling. So Smith's observation changes everything. In academic philosophy, right, theorizing about justice has a history of starting by asking us to imagine how we would slice a pie. Ideally, how would this pie be sliced? So I want to ask you, could that be a bias? Here's another place to start, which is to say, well, acknowledge that the power to slice the pie, that's the kind of power that corrupts. Imagine concentrated power in the hands of the worst ruler in living memory. I mean, who do you think is it, your memory may not go back so far, but if you like, what is it, Mao, Stalin, Pol Pot? Worst ruler, Hitler, worst ruler you've ever heard, and assume what you know to be true. You know this to be a fact, that concentrated power actually does fall into the hands of people like that from time to time. So then there's a preliminary conclusion. When we're trying to think about what is politically ideal, we got two ways to ask this question. You might say, ideally, how much power would be held by people like that? Or another question you could ask is, how much power would be held by ideal rulers? If you're thinking about how the pie should be sliced, and you're thinking, okay, I want a ruler to have the power to slice the pie like that, period. Or maybe not. Maybe instead you're thinking, okay, in some sense, ideally, a ruler would have the power to slice the pie like that. But if you give a ruler the power to slice the pie like that, what's the ruler actually going to do with that kind of power? Is the ruler going to use that kind of power to slice the pie like that? Well, that will depend upon what the ruler wants. If it depends upon what the ruler wants, then it will depend upon what was the process that drew people into the competition to win that power in the first place. So I have a colleague, a friend, Robert Frank, who says that he finds it, and I was in London and he gave this talk and he said, what baffles me is that you people, it's like, you people, Bob, what are you talking about, you people? But anyway, he says he finds it baffling that anyone would reject modest redistribution from rich to poor. So he starts by seeing the pie and knowing how he wants to slice it. But what if we instead start by seeing that power corrupts? Well, we might in turn find it baffling that Bob Frank would blithely endorse creating the power to redistribute from rich to poor. Why? Well, everyone should deplore the creation of such power when it will be used to redistribute from poor to rich, in fact. Or when it will be used to redistribute from people who have less political power to people who have more. So we want officials to have the power. I want officials, theoretically, I want officials to have the power to pursue my agenda. You want officials to have the power to pursue your agenda. How much power do we want officials to have? A lot of power. But we should be skeptical of conceptions of justice that make us gullible in that way, that make us think, well, if my conception of justice calls for the creation of that much power, then I should be in favor of creating that much power. It leads us to be in favor of giving enormous power to the people who most covet enormous power. Are the people who most covet enormous power are the people who want to do the same things with it that theoretically we want to see done with it? I don't know if even we fit that description. So the other thing to say then is that powers, you've heard this phrase, power corrupts, Lord Acton, absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's something implicit there, which is that however corrosive power is, however it tends to turn you into, that platonic tyrant, or the character from Lord of the Rings who had that ring, and the ring was inherently corrupting. That was an allegory for Plato, that it was corrupting because it had power. It was its own power. So the more power commands a higher price. That's the thing. Cosmetic tweaks to campaign finance laws are beside the point. Right? There's no mystery why candidates spend ever more money on campaign. It's not because regulators are becoming more lax. It's because the prize is getting bigger. The bigger the prize, the richer and more unscrupulous you have to be to compete for it. So it stands to reason, I would think, that the process by which people gain political appointment would systematically tend, and increasingly tend, to select the wrong people for the job. So it's a truism that power corrupts. It implies that randomly selected officers would be corruptible. But I think the more realistic worry is actually quite a bit worse than that. The more realistic worry is that the process of selecting officers is not random. It's not people picked out of a phone book that power corrupts. It's the people who want power that get it. So we select for corruption. It's not a randomly selected fox that ends up guarding the chicken coop. It's the most ravenous fox that ends up guarding the chicken coop. So a political debate then, I don't know, do we see this in the real world? You make the call, but theoretically, political debate should be descending into hens lobbying the fox to devour the other hens first. That's what we should be saying. So some candidates may be normal, but we can't sort them out by listening to their speeches. Right? Bot politicians don't name the names. They don't finger their own buyers. They finger the rivals of their buyers. So they all make speeches denouncing corruption, but they never target their own buyers. So the idea so far is that concentrated power to round through what we call justice, it's not a kind of power that merits endorsement in our corruptible world. And so what else is there? Is there any power that isn't a license to dominate or subjugate or otherwise treat subjects of power like pawns? Is there any power that wouldn't corrupt? Well, maybe the best answer we've got, decent, this isn't an original answer and it isn't fully satisfactory, is to say, well, powers that define liberal equal citizenship, the right to say no, rights to exit, constitutional limits on executive power, divided power, those are as innocuous as power can be. Those are the powers that limit rather than extend the reach of those who would treat us as pawns. So arguably, if there's any powers worth endorsing, it would be powers like that. And that, I don't know what the essence of that is, but it's to say something like, what you want to be in favor of is in a corruptible world is power that is inherently dispersed rather than concentrated. So the constitutional part of constitutional democracy, that's the part that enshrines these powers. The constitutional part of democracy, that's the liberal part. When there is a liberal part, there isn't always. It's premised on a core of individual rights, not subject to the whim of a shifting majority. So if you want democracy, you want constitutional democracy so that, for example, legislators can't vote on whether you have a vote. You don't want them sequentially targeting one minority after another. Right, let's see, let's get them this time, next time we'll get somebody else. So you bind legislatures because you don't want legislatures to be where the action is at. Maybe, I don't know, maybe this is naive of me, but I could say maybe there was a day, back in the good old days, golden age, where we aimed to vote for, we aimed to elect diplomats, we aimed to be represented by negotiators, that sort of thing. Now we want enemies, right? Now we're trying to eliminate enemies of our enemies. And I think it has predictable results. So, living in a free society involves, you don't want the legislature to be where the action is. You want the rules of the game to settle down and become a framework that enables the real players to develop plans around which, let real players plan, make expectations, develop expectations of each other. As with sports, if the game inspires, it'll be by virtue of what happens, what comes from letting the players play. Now, letting the players play, that's not the same as giving up. Right? If you say, no, I imagine myself having all this power, this is how much good I could do if I had all that power. Well, you probably should think more about how inspiring it could be to let the players play. Referees become the players, then what happens to the players? They become spectators. They become pawns. And so as legislators become players, right, you just sit there and watch and wait for the decisions that shape your life. And so the right to say no to that logic, I'm thinking, that's maybe the most liberal right there is. Montesquieu, an American founding fathers, they concluded that dispersed power is less corrupting than concentrated power, so they sought to create a system of divided sovereignty, backed by a free press, or policed in some sense by a free press. And that idea was functional enough to pretty much blow the lid off the ceiling of human condition progress as we knew it to be in the early 1700s. There is, I don't want to say, I don't know, this might be qualifying what I just said, I'm not sure. But I want to say there is a factual limit to how concentrated power can be, in the sense that as a hierarchy grows, it's adding layers of complexity, right? Layers of bureaucracy. And so the result is it's a proliferation of levels of middle management and local politicians. And as that is happening, you're getting not increasing but decreasing ability at the top to gather enough information to effectively monitor, to understand what's going on in those levels. And so human organization being what it is, it's concentrating power at the top entails delegating. As the larger the system gets, the more that entails delegating executive power to operatives on the ground, themselves, of course, corruptible. I'm not going to say anything about New Orleans. It's okay, maybe, great city. So maybe corruptibility is, maybe, I'm not sure even what this means, but it's something to think about. Maybe corruptibility is, in a way, it's as much a function of power's dispersal as of power's concentration. Although, I still want to say, if you actually look at power from underneath, from the bottom, in any case, inevitably, the problem is where it's concentrated. If you're subject to this, like if for all practical purposes, this local official has absolute power over you, then that power has been dispersed where it could be reconcentrated in the hands of this local official. It's still the concentration of power that's the problem for you. So even if dispersal and concentration are two different dynamics that limit each other, it's insofar as the power is concentrated in a decision-making node that it becomes a problem for the people that are subject to it. I also want to say that just a whole bunch of qualifications by way of understanding how much more interesting the idea of corruption is than you might think when you first look at it. Organizations can be corruptible without being vast. So expanding the parts of an organization from 1 to 2, with the second party having some discretion, that itself, we've already created a possibility of corruption. But the possibility still, that's the possibility, but the possibilities multiply as each link is added. And partly I'm thinking about this from an epistemological perspective, because you've got a whole that is losing, I think of this in Platonic terms now, you've got a whole that's, whether we're talking about a person or an organization, you've got a whole that's losing the ability to self-monitor its own motives. It becomes internally opaque as you've got a decision-making power dispersing the motives that drive decisions. So you've got a need, as you become opaque to yourself, you start needing regulatory bodies, right? And in some sense, ideally, like sort of you want an automatic nervous system that just doesn't say, hey Dave, you think we might want to, like, that cliff up ahead, you think we might want to make like a stop here? I say one of the reasons the dinosaurs went extinct, like they had 2 brains, and the brain that governed the seeing would say, this looks like bad news, I think we should stop. And the part that governs the legs saying, really? What? Why? And so just that gap in, right? That just sort of the slowing, having these different these different brains not being opaque, not being transparent to each other, trying to talk things through. That delay is one of the things that makes that an organism that is not fit to survive. So there's a kind of dispersal there, which you'd say, is that good in theory? Maybe it didn't work in practice, even if it was in some other sense good in theory. So it becomes increasingly true that the only people who know enough to design and interpret and apply the regulations, they're the people who's on the ground. They're the brains of the legs, right? Those people, the only people who know enough to see what's going on the ground, what needs to be done on the ground, those are the very people whom the regulations are supposed to regulate. So who writes banking reforms? This should not be a secret to any of you. It's bankers who write banking reforms. Nobody else has any clue what needs to be done to regulate banks. Who wrote the reforms for health insurance, which we voted on literally before even reading what we were voting on?
Health insurance companies.
Oh, very good, very good. I think, yeah, that's very much true. And so what happens, how do regulations work? There's a depressingly generic answer to how regulations work. Regulations make it harder for new competitors to enter the industry and compete with incumbents. That's a systematic property of regulation. Organizations employ officials to, in effect, speak on behalf of the organization, make decisions on behalf of the organization. So this isn't just about government, this is about organizations in general. So officials are often tasked with making it easier to transact with the organizations that they represent. Your call is important to us. Keep waiting. Now, when officials regard their authority as a service they're at liberty to sell for personal gain, then they treat themselves as licensed to make it harder to deal with the organization. So in countries where there's that kind of bribery, there is a certain inefficiency that's a consequence of that. And the less familiar you are with that system, the more costly it's going to be for you to deal with. Okay, so corruption, let's define it. I don't define things very often. I'm not very good at defining things, but let's try. It has something to do with fiduciary responsibility, the responsibility you have as an advocate for someone else, or as someone who's acting in someone else's best interest. So that's a really generic definition. Here's what you will more often see as a proposed definition. Corruption has to do with selling public favors, selling public rights or something like that, selling public power for private ends, making money by selling your services. So one of possibly the richest person in the world basically got rich by owning Western Union, I think, or some franchise of Western Union, and using that to take all of the Mexican expatriates, Mexicans working in the U.S., sending home tens of billions of dollars every year to their families back in Mexico, him charging a 10% service fee for that. And you think, is that really big? Well, you've got to be one of the richest people in the world doing that, basically. And so you say, well, was it his right? Maybe. And if it was his right, then that's not necessarily corrupt. But if you suppose that the person was a public official, say the Mexican government hired this person to just to provide this service, just to coordinate the flow of money from Mexicans working in the USA, coordinate the flow of money back to Mexican families. And you could see it kind of would make sense for the Mexican government to do that. Didn't do that. The British government did. The British government in the 1500s, right, there's just no commercial system. Their servers weren't as good as ours, slower servers and everything else. And so they, public officials weren't really on salary. Public officials just did things, right? Minions of the Pope did things, minions of the King did things. They volunteered to do things. And so if you are the person who is in charge of the Navy payroll, how do you get to be that? Well, you don't apply for a job. There isn't a job. You just volunteer to do it. But after you volunteer to do it, you charge a commission, right? Like maybe 10%. So somebody says, you know, I'm a sailor. I've shown up to get my paycheck. Okay, well, we don't have paychecks here. We have like a lot of lumps of gold and that sort of thing. But I tell you what, okay, we will get to you. Your call is very important to us. We will get to you in 3 years. And you say, my kids will be dead by then. And you say, okay, I can get you to the front of the line and see you this afternoon. That'll cost you 10% or whatever it will cost you. I don't know what kind of fees they charge, but they weren't on salary. They collected commissions for doing the jobs that they volunteered to do. They were accused of, the minions of the Pope accused them of corruption, minions of the King, and minions of the King said, look who's talking, like, you guys sell heaven. Give me a break. And so that's where the whole idea of corruption came from in the West anyway, is the idea was people selling, they have fiduciary duties as they're public officials with fiduciary duties, and they're collecting money that isn't part of their purview. They're like on their own initiative, needing to be paid for providing the service that ostensibly they should not be charging for. And so that was equated with greed. But corruption isn't essentially greed. Greed is a sort of paradigm of this corruption, but it's not the essence of it. It's not the definition of it. It's a bigger thing than that. It's to say when you're supposed to be, you're running you're running a mutual fund. If you're the manager of a mutual fund, your job is to try to do something like maximize returns for the people who buy shares in the company. And then you look at what your compensation package is. You get paid a percentage of assets under management. And so you say, well, how's that going to work? I'm not actually paid for making a profit. I'm paid for being trusted, which has some connection, but it's not a matter of, that's not a matter of. So, look, I'm going to start up 3 funds. And what I'm going to do with all the assets on management, I'm going to bet it on black, right? And then maybe 1 or 2 of them win, and then I say, look at me, look at my record as a fund manager. I got 100% returns, right? And they don't check into your whole record, but anyway, you'd say that's not even a public thing. That's still within a private realm, but we've got a fiduciary responsibility that is being manipulated and abused, in this case for money. Doesn't only have to be money. So you may have run into petty tyrants. If you haven't, you will, and I'm sorry about that. But they'll say the rules are the rules. What can you do? And if you're sitting in the office asking for a favor, you say, yeah, the rules are the rules. That's why I'm here, because the rules are the rules. And so what I'm saying is, the rule's getting it wrong in this case. I'm supposed to be able to do this, and this is against, doing this is against the rules, not doing this is against the rules, everything's against the rules. So I'm not denying that this is against the rules. I'm saying your job is to help me figure out a way to do this. And if the person likes your face, they say, all right, do it like this. If the person doesn't like your face, they say, oh, what can you do? The rules are what they are. And I'm thinking, that's potentially, at least, that's a kind of corruption as well. So they're withholding a service that isn't really theirs to withhold. What they're supposed to do is to say, look, we realize that rules are extremely crude, blunt instruments, they're going to get it wrong all the time, and what we have to do in particular cases is figure out ways for officials to make an exception with minimal disruption to the integrity of the system as a whole. That's what they're supposed to do. If they say the rules are the rules, I don't like your face, that's arguably a form of corruption. It's not greedy, it's hostile in a way. Or imagine, if you want something that's really hostile, imagine county officials, they are working on voter registration lists, and they're saying, you know, well, I am going the extra mile to make sure that no black person manages to register for the vote without having obeyed all the rules, and which can't be obeyed. And so you say, well, that's actually going along with the rules, rigidly sticking to the letter of the law in a way that's corrupt. So another form of, there's all kinds of, so I want to say there's all kinds of forms of corruption. People say, no, corruption is essentially a form of greed. I want to say life is a lot more complicated than that. It's not that simple. And there's a lot of things that fall under the heading, what is actually a more interesting heading, I think. It's not just about greed, it's about you have a job to do and you found an excuse for not doing it properly. Or you found a job that shouldn't be done and you found an excuse for doing that. So, sometimes a vacuum of reason, I would think, can be more corrupting than spurious reason, arbitrary reason. So if you have had officials like this, they're just dead to the honor of being good at what they do. They show up in appearance only, they're collecting a paycheck, killing time, waiting for retirement. They don't even aim to be good at their jobs. What they aim at is to be in compliance with job requirements. Maybe they have no ill will, they have nothing against anybody, but they're of no use. Or imagine your senior faculty and you've got junior colleagues who evaluate every decision they make. Go to lunch, serve on a committee, write a book, help a student, represent themselves as committed to scholarship. That's a means to the end of getting tenure. Now, it's a fact that after you've been around for a while, you realize that people motivated like that to be in compliance with tenure requirements, they tend to fall apart after getting tenure, right? There's nothing to do after they get tenure. So they tend to not have anything to do after that, and they tend to fall apart and become what we call deadwood. So, so really, if you think about what is a serious requirement for tenure, probably the most serious requirement for tenure is to not care that much about tenure. Right? People who care too much, they shouldn't get tenure. Because they're the people who are going to be just cashing paychecks for 40 years.